Welcome to the final session of the Evolution of American Society, where we will discuss challenges to American society. Over these 4 sessions, we will have waded through great detail on population, families, the economy, employment, government, as well as forces shaping social change. Today, we will discuss the impact on lives and assess unfinished advances and success stories. And I'd like to begin with some observations. The family unit in America is changing as a result of financial pressures and different social mores. American youth are more stressed and lonely, in part due to changes in the family unit, in part due to the impact of social media. Yet teen problems such as substance abuse, unplanned pregnancies, and high school dropout rates are falling. Residents of urban, suburban, and rural communities are estranged from their counterparts, citing different values and lack of understanding of their problems as regional mingling declines. Overall crime statistics have fallen, but mass shooting incidents occur with alarming frequency. Poverty, homelessness, and hunger are present in America, but efforts at amelioration are achieving some success. Longer life expectancy has given rise to issues of quality of life and care for elderly people, and the aging population has critical implications for the workforce, healthcare, and retirement funds. Women's role in society has become even more important, and this has gained more widespread recognition. Inequality in wages, especially as it affects the lowest wage earners, impacts on health, housing, and access to higher education. Yet education statistics are improving, giving hope for generational advancement. And finally, Americans are extraordinarily willing to contribute to their communities and extend a helping hand to their neighbors. Let us take a look at the family in America today. Here is a scene from the movie Rebel Without a Cause, which explored the generation gap in America and social estrangement among youth. Another good movie to look at family dynamics in the United States is Breaking Away, which describes the life of a family in Bloomington, Indiana. I always get confused with generation names, so I put up this slide. I'm a member of the Boomer generation, born in the period 1946 to 64, Generation X 65 to 80, Millennials 81 to 96, and Generation Z 97 to 2012, 15-year segments. There has been a dramatic change in how we meet our mate. Traditionally, people met their future spouse through family introductions, among friends, or schoolmates. Now, online dating dominates this process, with 30% of Americans using a dating app and 48% of those under the age of 29 using dating apps. The age at marriage has changed by more than 30%. For men in 1950, the average age for getting married was 22.8 years. By 2018, that had risen to 29.8 years. And for women, there's a similar change of 7.5 years in the case of women. Marriage numbers have fallen in all income and educational segments, but the highest decline has come in low-income individuals and low education individuals. And there is a correlation between low income and low education. The cost of marriage and establishing a household has become a disincentive for traditional marriage. In 1976, there were 40 million more married people than single people. By 2015, the number of both categories were equal at 125 million apiece. And of those 125 million single people, 75 million had never been married. Almost 1/4 of men 25 years or older have never been married, and in the case of women, it's about 17%. The divorce rate in America is down by 40%. This may reflect the fact that marriages are taking place later, and so there's better understanding of your potential mate, and the increase in the number of unmarried couples who are cohabiting. The age in which women give birth to their first child has changed dramatically. In 1970, that age was 21.4 years. By 2014, it was 26.3 years. And in 2018, it was 29.5 years. This reflects, of course, the fact that people are getting married later in life. And it also reflects that women are deferring birth of their first child to start their career. There has been a 15% decline in two-parent families in America, and 20% of families only have a mother present in the household. Over the 45 years between 1970 and 2016, the number of dual income families has risen from 49% to 66%. This, of course, reflects the cost pressures of housing, healthcare, education, and such. It is particularly troublesome to see the data on teenagers spending less time with their friends. In 1970, 12th graders met with their friends almost every day in the case of more than 50% of those teenagers. By 2015, that had fallen to 25 to 30% of teenagers seeing their friends every day. And this correlates with a growing sense of loneliness, which gets more intense in the later teens. Not only is this a factor in teenagers, but 69% of millennials and 81% of Gen Z people who are working feel lonely at work. I think this is related to social media. Among teenagers, there is a preference to text rather than to converse by phone or to meet in person. And texting does not convey the same sense of caring, of emotional connection, that talking to a person either over the phone or in person. And it is an easier effort to unfriend somebody via the media rather than in person. Pew Research, as we saw last week, shows mixed feelings about social media. I also find that young people are less adept at verbal communication with older people. 20% of teenage girls have had an episode of depression in the past year. And if you look at the article written by a psychologist in our extra reading, you'll get more detail on this. It is incredible that 13, 14-year-old girls are trying to counsel their peers who are having bouts of depression or suicidal thoughts. This is an unfair burden on a young lady who is not ready to handle these kinds of emotional challenges. 70% of teens polled in this Pew Research study say that anxiety and depression are a major problem. 55% say that being bullied is a major problem. And this is something that is widespread in this internet age. In 1986, 35% of people between the ages of 18 and 34 had no steady partner. By 2018, that had increased by almost 50% to 51%. And this reminds me again of the theme of the movie Rebel Without a Cause. Teen substance, on the other hand, is down. And if we look at alcohol, it's fallen from 70% of 10th graders who've used alcohol sometime in the past year to below 40%. Use of marijuana has hovered around 30% over the period between 1992 and 2018. And other drugs have held steady at below 10%. There's been a dramatic decline in teen pregnancies. From a high of 166 per 10,000 in 1960 to 37.5 in 2016 for 18 to 19-year-olds. The other figures show similar declines in younger teenagers. Now, part of this is a result of having access to birth control, which was not possible in the 1960s. And what is most encouraging is the 75% decline in high school dropouts. You can see that although Hispanics have the highest level, they have also experienced a very dramatic decline. For Hispanics, one of the problems relates to the fact that agricultural workers actually relocate numerous times during the year, and it makes it very difficult for a child in those circumstances to complete their high school education. But in all ethnic groups, there's been this very encouraging decline, and it raises great hope. Now let us take a look at what's happening in communities. Here is a photo of the 4th of July parade in Monterey in 2019. You see 4 senior majorettes marching down the street. My wife and I were sitting near the corner of Del Monte and Alvarado watching this parade. To our left, there was a couple with an adopted boy, probably 8 or 10 years old, who was so excited about the parade. And standing behind us were 2 Frenchmen. I know this because they were speaking French. At the end of the parade, I turned and asked the French gentlemen what they thought, and they said it was magnificent. They were really impressed. This was a nice sign of small town America. Religion has been a major source of society cohesion since the founding of the United States. Through churches, people have a moral code and supportive congregations. But membership is down by 1/3 across America. And when we take a look at attendance, which is in the lower chart, you can see that attendance at Catholic churches is down by 1/3 to 1/2, and the attendance by Protestants is relatively stable. In this chart, you can see that the younger Americans are less likely to have a religious affiliation. And in the case of Catholics, it's the young population which is dropping most rapidly in terms of attendance, while the Protestants' attendance by age is relatively stable. When we take a look at a map of America, and the dark colors are there where church attendance takes place, you can see that this attendance is concentrated in the South, in the Midwest, and the Rocky Mountains. When we take a look at the communities in America, urban, suburban, and rural, you can see green represents urban localities, The yellow is suburbs and small metropolitan areas, and then the gray is the rural area. We'll recall from the very first session that America is, by geographic reach, mostly rural. Urban areas are racially diverse, the population is growing, and it is aging. In the suburbs, 1/3 of the residents are non-Caucasian. The population is growing the most rapidly among the three types of communities, and it is also aging rapidly, indicating that there is an influx of seniors moving from urban areas. Rural areas are overwhelmingly white. They are barely growing in terms of population, and they're aging more gradually. Foreigners moving to the United States are settling in cities and suburbs. Domestic migration is moving from urban areas to the suburbs. And the rural areas are becoming less diverse as people are moving out of the rural areas to the suburbs. None of the community types believes that the other locales understand their problems, although this is less intense in suburban areas. This map depicts access to the internet. And you can see that it's widespread, but from the southeast to the Rockies, there are many places which have less than 20% access to the internet. In 2009, the American Recovery Act, passed by Congress, proposed expanding access to the internet, but there has been very minimal success. Rural and low-income families have the least access to the internet. And in those areas where there is limited access to the internet, businesses operate at a disadvantage in terms of their sales, in terms of market knowledge, and the ability to acquire components or raw materials. For students, there is difficulty in carrying out research. During the coronavirus crisis, many schools have shifted to online teaching. And in the Salinas Valley, schools discovered that there were many families that lacked a computer and also lacked any connection to the internet. So schools have distributed laptops, and Monterey Salinas Transportation has parked buses with hotspots in locations around different cities, as have other transportation companies, in order to give families access to the internet so that their children can actually participate in the education. This reiterates a point we made in session 3 about telecom infrastructure. We have to build up the structure. On May 17th, the Monterey Herald on the editorial page had an article describing how Gonzales has managed to connect every family in the city to the internet. When we look at the three types of communities, residents in those communities perceive that they have different values than their counterparts. Rural residents feel the greatest gap, while urban residents are not far behind. Suburban residents feel the most affinity with their counterparts, perhaps because they are the most mobile and share more contact. As you can see from this graph, rural residents are less mobile than residents of the other types of communities. 63% of rural families have lived in their community for at least 11 years. Internal mobility in the United States peaked in 1982 and has declined steadily since that time. This coincides with a rapid increase in housing prices, which probably was a disincentive to moving. In fact, internal mobility takes place most often within the very same county in which the family was residing prior to the move. Poverty is 30% higher in rural areas of America, and unemployment is marginally higher. So we see this as another example of how rural areas are falling behind and becoming more estranged. Now we'll go on to talk about crime. And here in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a U.S. postage stamp for Dick Tracy featuring his two-way wrist radio. In this case, it's an updated TV radio. In the lower corner, two policemen from a TV series called Car 54, Where Are You?, which followed the lives of two bumbling policemen in the Bronx. The violent crime rate in America peaked in 1992 and has fallen by almost one half since that time. There has been a huge change in youth crime, which is also very encouraging. But despite this fall in crime overall, mass shootings exploded in the 21st century. Between 2000 and 2018, there were 277 mass shootings. 864 people were killed and 1,546 were wounded. The worst example was October 2017 shooting in Las Vegas that killed 59 and wounded 500. Over 500 school shootings have taken place in the past decade. In 1999 at Columbine High School in Colorado, 12 students and one teacher were killed. In December of 2012, a young man broke into Sandy Hook Elementary School and killed 21 first graders, 4 teachers, the principal, and a school psychologist. This shows the location of mass shootings and school shootings as they have occurred across the country. And you'll notice that they're concentrated in urban areas, very few in rural areas, because shooters want to have the biggest impact and have the greatest publicity. %17 of mass shootings involve assault weapons, rapid fire that causes the most havoc and death. 59% involve high-capacity magazines. So in addition to assault rifles, you have pistols with large magazines. Assault weapons were banned between 1994 and 2004. There was no manufacturing or sales of assault weapons during that period of time, as well as a ban on magazines that carried more than 10 cartridges. There was a sunset provision included in the law to win passage in Congress. In the decade following the end of the ban, the number of incidents and the number of deaths tripled. Here's a photo of 2 homeless people living under tarps or under tents. And here is an iconic photo of the President of the United States visiting a family living in poverty in the Appalachian part of America. President Johnson launched the war on poverty with his State of the Union address in 1964, January of 1964. This was shortly after the assassination of John Kennedy, and President Johnson wanted to strike a note of hope going forward. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was passed in the summer, and it created the Office of Economic Opportunity, the Job Corps, Vista, and Head Start. The man that President Johnson selected to draw up the legislation and head the Office of Economic Opportunity was Sergeant Shriver, brother-in-law of John Kennedy, and a man who knew how to get things done. It's a political story in itself. And one fascinating story is that when Shriver was testifying before Congress day after day, if a congressman would give him any hard time, a phone call would be made that evening to a major political figure in the home district of that congressman, and that congressman would receive a slap on the back of the head. The legislation passed, but there was a fierce resistance in southern states from congressmen and senators. Between 1965 and 1968, the Office of Economic Opportunity had a budget of $2.64 billion, which is approximately equal to $19 billion in 2020. A small amount. But what you can see is that poverty did decline. The percentage of people living in poverty fell from 23% in 1960 to 13% in 2015. Now, with the growth of the population, there were still 42 million people living in poverty in 2015, the same number as in 1960. Among people age 65 and older, there was a 28.5% poverty ratio in 1966, and by 2017 that had fallen by to 9.1%, and an absolute decline from 56 million to 30 million. When we look at current levels, 2017, of people living in deep poverty, that is 50% below the federal poverty level, or at the poverty level in red, or low income, people who live in a family which is less than 200% of the federal poverty level, you can see that there are an unacceptable number of children living in poverty, and that there are huge disadvantages for African American families and Hispanics who have a poverty level. The children live in the number of children living in poverty are 2 to 3 times as high as in Caucasian families. And when we take a look at maps of poor residents in 1959 and in 2018, although they're different colors, we can see that there is a persistence of poverty in Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, and West Virginia. This is another example of the difficulty of living in Appalachia. Homelessness has become more visible in American society, but there has actually been progress in reducing the number of homeless. The number decreased by 15% between 2007 and 2018, and more are living in a sheltered place rather than out in the raw. It is estimated that there are 2,500 homeless people living in Monterey County. The largest number of homeless live in California and New York and in Florida. And when we look at the municipal level, the largest number of homeless are located in New York City and in Los Angeles County. But you can see there's a dramatic difference between the situations. More than 90% of the homeless in New York City spend the night in a shelter. In Los Angeles County, it's less than a quarter of the number of homeless. Partly that is a reflection of the multiple government jurisdictions in Los Angeles County, but it also may be affected by the weather. The fact that it is not as extreme in Los Angeles means there are less efforts to deal with the question of cold nights. The number of homeless students has actually doubled between 2006 and 2017 as a percentage of the population. It's now 3%, and that's equal to 1.6 million students. This is really surprising. These are students who have no fixed abode. They may be living with other members of their family temporarily, or with friends temporarily, or living in a car, or living in a shelter, but they don't have a home of their own. One of the major advances has been a reduction in the number of homeless veterans from almost 75,000 in 2009, 2010 to 38,000 in 2018. When we take a look at homeless people, we find that 71% are over the age of 24, 20% are under the age of 18, 67% are individuals, and 33% are families with children, 60% are male, 49% are white, and 40% are African American. 57% live in urban areas, and now 65% live in some sheltered organization. Now we'll talk about the challenge of elderly help. Here's a scene from the movie On Golden Pond, starring Katharine Hepburn and Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda is showing the early signs of dementia. He goes out for a walk and cannot find his way back to the home for several minutes. The number of people living in nursing homes in the United States, elderly people living in nursing homes, is approximately 1.5 million. The number of elderly living in assisted living is less than 1 million, but it is falling as more seniors rely on living at home with helpers there, or also relying on online physician appointments. More women are living in the assisted living residences than men by almost 3 to 1, a reflection of the longevity of women. 30% of people living in assisted living are age 75 to 84, and 52% over the age of 85. The burden of care for many elderly often falls on unpaid family members. There are 41 million family caregivers in the United States, most of them women. Half of them have been engaged in this care for more than 2 years, and 20% for more than 10 years. And half of the caregivers suffer from depression. There are 4.7 million people who were suffering from Alzheimer's in 2010, and that increased to 5.8 million by 2020, an increase of 23%. Medicare and Medicaid spending on Alzheimer's rose from $184 billion in 2010 to $261 billion in 2020. This is growing exponentially. But research funding for Alzheimer's has remained below $500 million during that entire period. Now we're going to look at challenges and progress in social equity in America. Despite progress being made in addressing poverty, in 2014, a quarter of Hispanics and blacks were living in poverty, twice the ratio for Caucasian families. And when we take a look at African Americans and Hispanics in prison, they also had an outsized portion of the number serving in prison. In 2002, African Americans were 2.6 times as likely as Caucasians to be in prison. By 2017, that was 2.2 times. Now, we've seen this slide before in our first session. It is the median household income by race. And in 1975, African American families had a median income of $31,000 per year. That rose by 2017 to $40,000 per year, an increase of 29% 25% during that period, but still only 60% of the income level of Caucasians. For Hispanics, the median income in 1975 was $40,000, and that climbed to $50,000 by 2017, a 25% increase in salary. But still only 74% of a Caucasian family's income. And for Caucasian families, median income rose from $52,000 to $68,000, an increase of 31%. And when we take a look at home ownership, you can see that there have been changes between 1986 and 2016. Hispanic families, their home ownership has increased by 10%, but for African Americans, it's actually declined by 3%. When we take a look at the different levels of healthcare uninsured rates among non-elderly individuals, we can see that there has been progress made since the introduction of the Affordable Care Act. And for Hispanic families, that uninsured rate fell by 1/3, and for African Americans, it fell by almost a half, and for Caucasians, it fell by 40%. So this is important progress. But minorities are still more likely to forego health care. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is a question of cost. On the right-hand side, there are various other reasons why they have delayed needed care. Preventative health care, that is regular checkups and early intervention when there is an illness, save money and lives. Now, over the course of our discussions, I have not commented on the coronavirus epidemic because it is still unfolding. However, this chart brings out information which I think is important for us to be aware of, and that is that the number of blacks who are dying during this crisis is much higher than the Caucasians. And you should look at both the number of deaths and also the mortality rate. This reflects underlying medical conditions that the African American population suffers from, but also their access to medical care. Healthcare for Native Americans is in crisis. Of the 5 million Native Americans residing in the United States, 1 million live on reservations, and their care is provided by a specialized service, the American Indian Health Service. This health service is poorly managed and chronically underfunded. For those 1 million residents, there are only 725 doctors and 2,600 nurses, which is a doctor-patient ratio only 1/4 of what is true across the country as a whole. It is hard to retain these doctors because they receive lower pay, they work in remote locations, and for any service other than general medicine, patients are sent to other hospitals, preventing young doctors from being able to practice their specialties. There have also been cases of physicians abusing their patients. Now, when we take a look at food stamps, and this is also referred to as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. This was introduced during the period of the Great Society. And over time, there have been ups and downs in the number of recipients of food stamps. But there was a large surge following the Great Recession because of unemployment and lower salaries. And it peaked in 2013 at 47.6 million people. By 2019, it had fallen to 35 million people, a 25% decline. And the total bill for that year was $60 billion. Food stamp recipients average $280 per month per household. and the average value per meal is $1.40. So you can see that this is not people who are eating filet mignon. 50 to 65% of the families have a person working, and food stamps are supplementing the low level of income that they have. 44% of recipients of food stamps are children. And when we look at the areas of the country which have the highest level of food stamp use, which is the dark colors, the black and the purple, you can see that it's Appalachia, the eastern seaboard, the southwest, and the northwest. 1 in 7 families in the United States face some form of food insecurity. And one of the programs that is designed to deal with this is under the United States Department of Agriculture, which provides free meals to schools. There are 29.7 million students who receive a free lunch each day in school, and 14.7 million students who receive a free breakfast. These become essential nutrition for these children. One of the results of the coronavirus impact is that because schools are closed, these children are not getting those regular meals. Fortunately, there are groups that have been mobilized to deal with this problem, and although it's not as steady as it has in the past, there are still meals getting to these children. 1 in 5 Monterey County families receive food from the food bank, and half of these people are children. Now, if we take a look at unemployment, you can see that African Americans and Hispanics have a higher unemployment rate than for Caucasians, but there has been improvement in each of those areas. In February of 2020, the overall unemployment rate was 3.5%, the lowest in many years. There's been a dramatic change since the coronavirus outbreak, and we don't know where it will stop, but hopefully it will not get to the record that was seen in the Great Depression. Now, since 2007 and to the current time, there was a decline in employment for all people in the United States, but then a recovery that began around 2012. And African American women have seen their employment ratio rise by 4.6%, and African American men have seen it rise by 1.3%. Since the level in 2007. And median wages has also changed. For Black employees, their salaries have increased by 4.3% from the levels before 2007. Average salaries for American workers have grown very slowly over the last 50 years. Now, this chart shows that in 1964, the average hourly wage was $2.50 per hour, and by 2018, it had reached $22.65. So more than almost 10 times. However, when you discount the impact of inflation, the increase has been approximately $2, because $2.50 in 1964 is the equivalent of $20.27 in 2018. In an effort to dig deeper into the question of fairness of wages for workers, we can take a look at worker compensation as a portion of national income, which includes compensation of employees, proprietor's income, which is small business income, corporate profits, rental income, and net interest. As you can see in the upper chart, between 1948 and 1972, the proportion of worker wages in national income ranged from 50 to 52%, and then began a gradual descent in the following years. And in 2018, it was approximately 43%. Now, the lower chart shows the value of benefits received by workers, including paid vacation, paid sick leave, pension, and health care benefits. And those have risen during that period from about 3.5% up to 10%. So on a combined basis, the portion of compensation and benefits that workers receive in the United States has been fairly constant over this period of time. And obviously national income has increased along with population. Now, in comparing these figures with other countries, the United States and Germany pay the highest portion of national income to workers. And they're very close. Those two countries are very close. Other countries have substantially smaller levels of national income flowing to workers. The other side of the story is corporate profits. And here you can see corporate profits in the United States as a share of national income have been as high as about 12.5%, and in 2018 they were at 7.5%. Unfortunately, I have not been able to uncover comparable figures for other countries to give an indication of how the United States rates. And we're faced with a dilemma here, one that Mark Twain talked about as lies, damn lies, and statistics. Do we have figures that quantify the fairness here? And they're very murky in that case. So I cannot give you a clear quantification of what is the level of fairness in the balance between workers' compensation and corporate profits. What is clear is that when workers receive increased salaries, most of those increases are going to the top earners. And you can see that the lowest 10th percentile has seen very little change in their salaries. And as the bulk of these wage increases go to the top earners, the gap between low earners and high earners gets bigger and bigger. And this greater increase to the higher earners holds true for both genders and ethnic bases. In all cases, the wage increases are heavily weighted in favor of higher income workers. And here's a different representation of salaries for workers, looking at the entire universe. 46.5% of workers earn less than $30,000 per year in the United States. 21% earn between $30,000 and $50,000. 22% $50,000 to $100,000, and 9% from $100,000 to $250,000, with 1.4% earning more than $250,000 per year. Now, high school graduation rates have increased across the board. This is very encouraging. White students completing their high school education have climbed from 51% in 1964 to 93% in 2015. For blacks, it's gone from 27% to 89%, a really dramatic increase. And for Hispanics, it's gone from 33 to 67%, taking into account what we spoke about earlier in terms of the difficulties of agricultural families who move during the course of the school year. And the inverse is also a similar record. This is the dropout rate. So Hispanic dropout rate has fallen from 34% to 10%. For blacks, from 16% to 7%. And for Caucasians, from 8% to 5%. One of the problems facing students going on beyond high school is the cost of education. And here you can see that student loans are a burden for all students, most for blacks, where they have an average student loan of about $14,500. For white families, it's about $12,000. And for Hispanics, it's below that. When we look at the gender gap in income, you can see that whatever the level of education, there is a gap. And the percentage seems to increase even in the case of an advanced degree and higher levels of salary. There is a glimmer of hope here, and in looking at these two different graphs, one showing all workers age 16 and older, and all workers age 25 to 34, there's a suggestion in this that women entering the workforce at a younger age are getting a better shake in terms of the salary gap, but it isn't very clear in this, and there's clearly much more that needs to be done to address this gap. Meanwhile, Hispanic women are thriving in college, and they're choosing majors with good job prospects, and that will ultimately benefit the community. As an example, I have met two Latinas from Salinas who went to UC Berkeley and majored in public health, and then returned to Salinas to work in the county department of health, public health, and subsequently have gone on to postgraduate work. And I expect that both of them will be back in Salinas making important contributions to the community. Here you can see a photo of Arizona State University graduation, and this is empowerment for Hispanic women. I would like to add a quick snapshot of the value that immigrants add to California. There are 10.7 million immigrants living in California. 2 in 5 of these immigrants are self-employed business people, and they generate $21.8 billion in revenues. Immigrant households have $239 billion worth of spending power. They pay $57 billion worth of federal taxes and $26 billion worth of state and local tax. And they play a key role in agriculture in particular. And I want to conclude this section by bringing back maps that we've looked at over the previous 3 sessions. And starting in the upper left-hand corner, this is the CO2 emissions per capita in the United States. And you can see California has one of the best records in that, meaning the lowest levels per capita of CO2 emissions. In terms of mortality, California is one of the top 10 states in terms of low mortality rates. And in asthma, similarly, they're one of the lowest. California introduced smoke-free restaurants, the first state to do so in the United States in 2002, and set a pattern for the country. And the value of these reduction in emissions and smoking in restaurants is shown in the cancer rates in California and lung cancer rates. California is outperforming. By taking this initiative, by putting guidelines and regulations in place, Californians are enjoying better health and a better environment. Now we go to our final section here. Americans really do care. It's an impressive amount of donations made by Americans, $450 billion in 2018, almost triple the amount in 1978. And far and away, the most important source of donations is individuals. Over half of the population makes donations here in 2017. But if we extract the number of children from the population, 71% of adults are making donations. In 2014, there were 63 million volunteers in America working for various volunteer organizations, 25% of all adults, and they volunteered a total of 8.7 billion hours. In 2018, the number of volunteers rose to 77 million, 30% of the population. And these volunteers come from all walks of life, male and female, white, black, Asian, Latino, single, married, by age group and by level of education. Another form of donations is organ donations, and the number of organ donors increased by 135% in the 15 years between 1991 and 2017. Another case of caring is adoption. And here we're looking at adoptions which take place outside of a family, no relationship, blood relationship before the adoption took place. And you can see there were 70,000 in 2014. Americans adopt more children than any other country in the world. Many of these adoptions originate through the foster care system, more than 50%. Many of the children who are adopted have special needs. And in addition to the 69,000 you see here in 2014, there were another 41,000 in which members of the family adopted one of the children from another part of the family. Now, international adoptions, on the other hand, have fallen, and this is a result of two major changes. Russia banned all adoptions by Americans because of a U.S. law which sanctioned human rights violators in Russia, and Russia retaliated by saying no more children can go to America. In China, the number has dropped dramatically because of changing attitudes toward girls and the end of the one-child policy. I want to relate to you a personal example. My nephew and his wife adopted a girl from an orphanage in China in 2008. She's now 13 years old. She's completing the 7th grade. She's involved with swimming, track, basketball, and volleyball. She has an excellent academic record. She also is doing very well socially. She was recently selected to be one of the incoming 8th graders who will welcome 6th graders joining their school for the first time this fall. And she describes herself as a chatterbox. She's really an amazing girl, a wonderful example of how placing a child in a nurturing environment allows them to achieve their full potential. And I am particularly proud of my brother and sister-in-law for the fact that they treat this girl, Grace, just as though she were blood-born. Here's a picture of an adopted family. You can see that this family had 4 children of their own, and then they adopted the 5th child to make it a more complete family. And so on this hopeful note, I will close. I applaud you for your endurance, for lasting through these 4 long sessions, and I appreciate your good questions and look forward to our discussion session next Wednesday.